eller igjen, eller fortsetter. Det altså dokumentarkino med Ketil og meg, John Jones, fra Voksenåsens Dag Hammarskjöld-program, som inviterer til dette møtet på Litteraturhuset. Om 5 minutter så skal vi få treffe og snakke, og dere kan kanskje forberede noen spørsmål kanskje til Daniel Ellsberg, hvis jeg er interessert i det. Det liksom litt møte med historien. Men aller først så skal Norman Solomon fortelle om hva vi gjør i Oslo disse dager. På første rad så sitter det ca. 13-14, mange av dem veldig kjente whistleblowers, ikke så kjent som Daniel Ellsberg, men i USA veldig kjente, og både elsket og hatet da, selvfølgelig. So we'll start the meeting by having an introduction by Norman Solomon. He has different hats or faces, and Exposed Facts is one of the groups, and he is initiated to this together with me. So Daniel from Washington. No, Norman, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Should I just...
Maybe you can use this one.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, because most of you here have seen the film tonight, The Most Dangerous Man in America, I get to fast forward to the last several years and tell you something that will be, I think, no surprise at all, which is that Dan Ellsberg has continued since the time of the release of this documentary film to do what he's been doing for several decades. And that is to try to propagate the kind of society where it's not only possible, but it is encouraged and supported to be truthful about the actions of the states and the corporations that have so much power in our societies. And Daniel Ellsberg is somebody who works with others. He's not a lone ranger. He's someone who every day is tirelessly engaged in that process, raising questions that we're frequently trying to find answers to. What is the truth of our situation? How can we challenge the warfare state, the surveillance state, and work together? And so Dan speaks and agitates and organizes and protests, and among his many activities has been to work with exposedfacts.org, which is an organization founded in June, part of the 17-year-old Institute for Public Accuracy based in Washington. And Dan wrote a brief statement that I'd like to read to you, which has been up on billboards throughout Washington, D.C. this summer and into the fall, next to the State Department. And when the billboard went up, one of the speakers you'll hear tonight, Matthew Ho, a former Marine and State Department official, helped cut the ribbon of the billboard just a few meters really from the front of the U.S. State Department. And this billboard also has gone up near the White House, near the Congress, near the Iraqi embassy in Washington. It has a picture of Daniel Ellsberg and then a quote from him, the following: "Don't do what I did. Don't wait until a new war has started. Don't wait until thousands more have died before you tell the truth with documents that reveal lies or crimes or internal projections of costs and dangers. You might save a war's worth of lives." In just a few words, that conveys so much of what Dan Ellsberg continues to say and work toward. And now we get to be in direct communication with Dan via the miracle of Skype. So onward, and thanks very much for being here.
Due to technical problems, I have to stand up here to interview him, but you will see his face on the board. So.
It's not a question time at this point. I take it I'm supposed to.
Okay.
We'll have questions.
We're about to get your face on the board, okay. Dan. There you are.
Now, am I just going to start speaking, or what?
Well, let me just ask you. Take us back to the 70s. And to these first moments of your revealing, and what these first emotions when you broke that hard wall of getting out to the public with these secrets. What went in your mind those days?
Okay. There was a time when I faced some choices that several of the people that you have the privilege of hearing from today, Matthew Hull, Coleen Rowly, and Kirk Wiebe, all faced when they were insiders. And that was whether they should continue to participate in keeping certain secrets that they had promised to keep, as a matter of fact. Not necessarily those specific ones, but we had all agreed as a condition of employment that we would not reveal or information that we got in the course of our work or criticize publicly outside our agencies policies that we thought were wrong-headed or even illegal. That was not put to us, that we might be encountering policies that were illegal, and it may not have been in any of our minds. But I'll speak now for myself, and I know that they all face the same issue. We looked at policies that were, whether illegal or not, were reckless murderers, in my case, and Matthew Hull's case, looking at wars in particular, that raised constitutional issues. And Kirk Wiebe was facing in the National Security Agency, looking at warrantless surveillance and wiretaps that were going on. So extremely wrongful policies that were being wrongfully kept secret from the public. In my case, I knew in 1969 that a new president, Richard Nixon, for whom I had not voted, but for whom I had worked earlier in that same year of 1969 in the executive office part of the White House on Vietnam options. And I knew by the fall that he had chosen what I regarded as a wrong option, and not merely one that was less preferable to the others, not optimal, too costly. My objections went far beyond that. I saw that his policy, which was based on nuclear threats against North Vietnam, but also just threats more broadly of escalation, of renewed bombing, and perhaps beyond that, mining of Haiphong, which eventually did happen, sending troops possibly into North Vietnam, which thankfully did not happen, or the nuclear weapons. But threats that I thought would not succeed in getting the terms he asked for. That was that the North Vietnamese should remove all their troops from the southern part of what all Vietnamese regarded as one country, Vietnam. They should remove all their troops back to the north of Vietnam. This was something they were not going to do and never did do. But Nixon thought that his threats of nuclear weapons and other escalation would achieve that. He was mistaken, I was sure, and I was right about that. He was wrong. That meant, however, would he carry them out? That raised the question. And I knew from my study of past presidential decision-making, which I'd read actually in the 7,000 pages of the top secret, what came to be called the Pentagon Papers study, I knew that other presidents had made threats and had felt compelled to carry them out when they failed. I was sure these would fail. I believe Nixon would carry them out, as he did, not entirely. And that meant a longer war and a bigger war than we ever did experience. The war did become bigger than it ever had been in the air, in bombing, in the course of several years. And it could have gone even well beyond that, into nuclear war and even invasion of the North. So it did become bigger, but that was what I feared. And I thought, okay,
if we jump till today, you avoided prison. You were never imprisoned, and today we know we have at least 3 rather famous people being in some sort of prison for being whistleblowers. What is going through your mind today when you look at Snowden, Assange, and Manning?
Now, Snowden is in exile, or he would be not just in prison, but in the kind of isolation cell that Chelsea Manning endured at Quantico, Virginia for 10.5 months with the UN rapporteur for torture, not being allowed to see him as he was, he now Chelsea. But Bradley Manning was not allowed to be interviewed by the UN rapporteur, who just proclaimed that his conditions of isolation cell were cruel and inhumane treatment verging on torture. Public protest in that case did get him out into the general prison population, where she will be now for the next 35 years or so. That's what she's sentenced to. To avoid that, Snowden had to be in exile in order to be able to coordinate with the newspaper people that he has given this material to give them instructions on how to interpret acronyms and the relations between the various programs. He's done that almost daily on encrypted voicemail of various kinds, and that was necessary. He couldn't have done it in this country. He'd be in an isolation cell, as I say. John Kiriakou, you mentioned, is in jail for prison for 30 months for having revealed the name of a torturer, an American torturer, keeping in mind that no American torturer has been investigated as far as we know, but at least has not been indicted or prosecuted for this criminal activity against international law and U.S. domestic law. The only person in jail for having initially revealed that we were torturing people with waterboarding, that was John Kiriakou, and then having given a newsman the name of one of those torturers, he's in prison. Now that is the negation of democracy, because that was information the public needed to know, should have had, and was being wrongfully withheld. Likewise, Chelsea Manning revealed that we were turning people over to Iraq for torture, and knowing that that was happening, and we were telling the people who complained about this, Americans, they should not investigate further. That was an illegal order. Under international law, we were required to investigate credible allegations of torture and to stop them. And of course, to do both, to fail to investigate and to turn people over to be tortured, was as much of a crime in both domestic and international law as the torture itself. And that reaches right to the current White House, President Obama himself. He could validly be charged by the International Criminal Court at The Hague for being complicit in a process of torture, a criminal process. And I'm sure that has something to do with the way Chelsea Manning was treated. She also revealed thousands, tens of thousands of civilian deaths from our operations that had not been reported anywhere on the press or anywhere, but were actually known to our Pentagon, which was wrongfully keeping that information secret. So, in short, the choice that Chelsea faced, and the choice, as I say, that Coleen Rowly and Matthew Ho and Kirk Wiebe and others all faced in different forms, was, should we continue to be complicit in what we regard as a policy that does not deserve secrecy, that actually we are obliged conscientiously in support of our own U.S. Constitution to reveal to the public, even though it's in contradiction to our employment terms, to the promise we made to keep secrets. None of us, I'm sure, even gave thought when we first signed those agreements that we would be confronted with a question of keeping secret wrongful, illegal policies. But that turned out to be the reality. We made the choices that did affect all of our careers very strongly from then on, that at the cost of our careers, and perhaps even greater costs, we would tell the truth with documents, or tell the truth to the public. And really, that's what that poster was encouraging people to do right now. Because right at this moment, the President Obama, for who I supported, by the way, in both of his elections. Actually, I supported him not because I thought he would be more transparent, even though he promised that. I didn't foresee he would be less transparent in his government than any previous president, or that he would indict 3 times as many people for leaking, including whistleblowers, as all previous presidents put together. That's been a surprise, and it's actually not easy to explain.
You must have had some ideas, Dan. You must have had some ideas of why, how, what are the forces that forces or makes Obama act like he does?
I've just said it's hard to explain. I've asked many people. I think one reason was that he expected to continue once he got in. I don't know how much he knew before he'd been briefed on his new capabilities as commander-in-chief and as head of the intelligence branches, for taking actions that lay entirely outside the rule of law. And I think he soon realized that he was going to continue the kinds of surveillance that were going on already, which required secrecy from the public to keep there from being serious debate and opposition to those policies, and doing things like Chelsea Manning revealed, turning people over to Iraqis who would torture them, keeping open alive the possibility of rendition, that is, kidnapping people to various places where they might well be tortured. And he knew he needed a lot of secrecy. And why, that still raises the question, why didn't George W. Bush, who's had the same motives, prosecute people? He had one indictment, which actually failed. It was thrown out of court, basically, by judges' decisions under Obama. But why didn't he bring 9 indictments or 90 indictments for leaks? There were at least that many leaks. There were many more than that. I don't know. I can't answer that. So you've asked me a question that I've just said is very puzzling. But let me tell you, though, that was not that big a surprise for me. My hope for Obama was that he was less likely than his rivals, either Democrats, Hillary Clinton, or Republicans like Romney or McCain earlier, to involve us in war with Iran or Syria, or as has happened, or to go back into Iraq, or to increase numbers in Afghanistan, etc. I think that was right. I think he is more reluctant to do that than any of those rivals would be, including Hillary Clinton, who might succeed him. But nevertheless, we find him doing it under pressure from the right, pressure of events, fear of being blamed for not doing it. He's involved us now in attacks on Syria, which are very questionably legal under any constitutional rule, whether the president has the ability to do that without a decision by Congress or without a decision of the UN Security Council. Going back into Iraq, same. But aside from the question of their legality, the question of their prudence, their wisdom, there is none. It's, as Matthew Ho has said quite rightly, the only word for involving ourselves in the civil wars and the multiple, it's not a two-sided civil war. In both cases, in Syria and Iraq, you've got many-sided civil wars. And for the U.S. to involve ourselves militarily in that not only has no justification, it's crazy. It's crazy as could be. Now, that I am certain there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people inside the government who know where we're headed, who know, for example, I'm certain this is the case, that there is secret planning going on, not conspiratorially, just what the Pentagon does, planning for the introduction of U.S. ground troops into Iraq, something that the president has said will never happen. Now, does President Obama really believe that he will be able to keep control of that process and that he will not send any ground troops to Iraq? If he does, if he's confident of that, he's foolish. He's overestimating his degree of control over this dynamic process here. But even if he does intend to do that, will he succeed? And will his successor stand by the same restriction? Very unlikely. Today's news is that his own Secretary of Defense has joined his own Chief of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, in saying U.S. ground troops are required. That's in direct contradiction to the president. Now, I'm saying, I'm sure that despite what the president has told us, no ground troops, plans are being made in the fullest detail for which ground troops will be sent if the president decides to send them, how they will be sent, the logistics of that, how many will be needed, how many less than that will we probably send, et cetera, and how many really are needed. Dempsey has already indicated something like 80,000 ground troops are needed. That's a very low estimate, considering he had far more than that already. And considering what we're facing in Iraq, what is the meaning of needed, by the way? Actually defeating ISIS in Iraq? That's not going to happen. With how many troops? That's my judgment from Vietnam. I'd be interested to hear of Matt Ho, who's had even much more experience in these kinds of wars than I did in Vietnam. He's been in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I would like to hear whether he thinks 80,000 troops will destroy ISIS in Iraq. It won't. But if the military thinks so, okay, they're making plans for that. Those plans should be made known. So when the Congress considers whether to vote on going into Iraq, which of course they should, it's their responsibility to vote up or down on that. I understand that Congress is backing away from that responsibility. They don't want to be blamed for the decision, whichever way it goes. So they're not insisting that they fulfill their constitutional responsibilities to decide on war and peace. But they should be urged to do that by the public and by some of their members. And to do that, they need to know what the Pentagon really thinks will be called for if they, in effect, go into war, if they join with the President and the Joint Chiefs in going into war in Syria. Those plans should be public. They should be demanded by Congress, which is not doing it. So they should be leaked. They should be leaked to Congress and to the public right now, before we get into war. And that means by somebody who's fully aware that he or she doing that is risking their life's freedom, their career, their clearance, their job, their families, very serious risks. I would say to them they should not go first to the Inspector General or to the Congress secretly on this, which will likely do nothing. That's what Kirk Wiebe did do, and I think he would be the first to say that nothing positive really came out of that. But they should do, I think, what Ed Snowden did, which is to give that information to the Congress, what the nature of these plans are. They don't have to give what they as individuals can perceive, and they can see this as well as anybody, should not go out, would actually endanger our national security. But in terms of the general nature of that planning, Congress should be made aware of it. I'm being very specific here in a way I plan to do, but in answer to your question. And they should not wait for Congress to put that out to the public. They should put it out themselves and leave it to an editorial judgment, as Snowden has done and is doing, as to whether the editorial staff feels certain parts of that should be made public and perhaps certain parts should not. Leave it to that judgment. I certainly rely more on the judgment of such responsible people than that of the Joint Chiefs themselves. Or let's say of a person like Clapper, head of intelligence, the one who told the Senate that we were not collecting information on hundreds of millions of Americans, or even millions. Hundreds of millions is correct. When the correct answer was, truthful answer was yes, he was doing that. His judgment as to what the public should know, he shouldn't even be asked to make a judgment on that. That's not his business. Telling secrets, telling information, informing the public is not what he's paid for, and is not what he should even be asked to do. It's what Congress is paid for, and the press in the end. And if Congress won't live up to their responsibilities, yes, the press will do a better job of that than the secret keepers in the government.
Dan, if we go back, I'll invite the audience here to pose questions to you. So feel free to come up here and question Dan. And in the meanwhile, I would like you to comment upon a very thing that's going on in Norway these days. I mean, we are also sending troops to Iraq, and a party like the Green Party and Nonviolent Party is endorsing that and supporting that sending. They say we need to do something. What is your message to them?
Well, what is happening in Iraq is, in many respects, murderous, terrible, terroristic. Obviously, they're confronting people there who are acting on an ideology of killing people of their own Islamic religion, but who do not share their particular Islamic doctrine and spirit. The idea that Shia deserve to die because they're heretics is a repulsive and murderous idea, and is held clearly being acted on by the members of ISIS. What to do about that? The feeling that one should be doing something about that is not only understandable, it's inevitable, it's a compelling feeling. But after the experience of the last century, I would say, people should ask very strong questions when their leaders or their colleagues or anybody else says, well, something must be done. Let's send some troops over militarily. Let's bomb. Let's kill people, knowing that the bombing, by the way, will kill more civilians, inevitably, and always, than it kills, quote, enemies or terrorists. I think the figure for the areas in Pakistan where we've been sending drone strikes for years now under Obama is something like 17, quote, innocents, non-combatants being killed to every, quote, terrorist who's being killed. There's no question at all, by the way, that process recruits more terrorists, creates terrorists out of the families of the innocents killed, 17 to 1 here, not only the ones who are already involved in the effort. It increases danger to the United States and to all the other countries that are involved, including Norway, in this case, when they're sending troops and they're part of this process. Is that necessary? Well, the first thing to ask is it in any way helpful? Who will be benefited by the presence of Norwegian troops in Norway? Let me make an estimate on that off the top of my head, but that reflects 40 years of watching these processes very closely and participating in them myself wrongfully in Vietnam. And Matthew Ho has very similar, even more experience, though not as long a time. My guess is, ask Matthew, the presence of Norwegian troops will serve no human interests, no national interests of NATO, of Norway, except friendliness between the secret keepers and the war makers in the U.S. and Norway. Yes, good relations with the U.S. government. I served by that. But will the people that Norwegians kill, will the Norwegians who are killed in that process have in any way served the national interest other than this one of relations with the U.S. of Norway, or made them safer? Will they have died or killed to make Norwegians safer? No, they will make Norwegians less safe. The Americans who are in that process have made and will make Americans less safe by that process. Whatever interests they serve, it will not be the interests of American citizens' security. How about Iraqi interests and Syrian interests if they go to Syria? You haven't said whether Norwegians may end up in Syria, but why not? If the U.S. Eventually goes there, and will other NATO members all refrain? Some will, some won't. I would hope Norwegians are among those who won't. And as I say, the reason is that military involvement, the bombing, my judgment, check it by every other source. I'm not the last word on anything here. My judgment, though, as a person of some experience in these things and some study is, that bombing will not serve any Iraqi purpose other than ISIS. I think that ISIS is so anxious to be bombed by the U.S. and thus present themselves as the vanguard and the leaders of a struggle for independence or the absence of foreign influence, and so anxious to be regarded as the bête noire and of the United States of America, that their beheadings on television are for no other purpose than to encourage that involvement by the U.S. and by Norway and by the others. After all, Saudi Arabia beheads far more people than ISIS has, officially, but not on television. Likewise, the rebels, the people we're supposedly supporting in Syria, behead people right and left, not on television. Why ISIS being so blatant about this? I think for no other reason than to tell the U.S., as George W. Bush famously put it, to record, bring it on. Come and get us, because nothing does so well by them, by strengthening this murderous group of ISIS, than to be killing non-combatants and even combatants by foreigners, led by the United States. And anyone, I think any Norwegian who says that you are serving the interests of the people of Iraq by involving yourself in them is mistaken, because you are strengthening ISIS when you do that. And when I say that 80,000 troops will not do the job, I'd like to hear if Matthew Ho, judgment I really rely on her, disagrees with me on the following. ISIS will be stronger with 80,000 U.S. troops in that area than it is now. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's what happened in Iraq before. That's what happened in Afghanistan and is happening. And we should learn some lessons from our own failures as well as from others. We refuse to learn the lessons of what happened to the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. They refused to learn what had happened to the British a century earlier. Every imperial power thinks to themselves, that history doesn't apply to us. We're stronger, we're better, we're more idealistic, we're more efficient, more competent. We won't suffer those same failures, and so they just brush off those lessons. What did Norwegian troops accomplish in Iraq before? Did they go before? I assume from what you're saying that they did. I'm asking you, did they go before in the first, what could be called the second Iraq War, not the Gulf War, but the Iraq War in 2003? Did Norwegians go over?
Not Iraq, but we went to Afghanistan.
I'm sorry?
To Afghanistan, yes, we went to Afghanistan.
And Libya.
And Libya, but not Iraq. So these are the first time we go to Iraq. To Iraq.
Oh, Afghanistan. They did go in Afghanistan?
Definitely.
Yes?
Yeah, we're active there still.
Okay, let's ask very closely, ask the people who are for in this involvement, what did they accomplish in Afghanistan? For the Afghans? Any side? Other than, by the way, to improve the Taliban strength. They strengthened the Taliban. Taliban were probably quite happy to see the Norwegians and all the others there. But the non-Taliban, what did they accomplish? And what did they accomplish for Norway and for world peace? Is that or is that not relevant evidence for whether they should go to Iraq now? And anyone who says it isn't relevant is a fool or a liar.
Daniel Ellsberg will now turn to Matthew Ho and some Mr. Solomon and Rowley and the group here. We'd like to thank you so much for sharing this time with us, and thank you.
I might say that I'm pleased that you've seen this movie, Most Dangerous Man. I think it was shows what can occur. There's no guarantee, but what can occur when people are whistleblowers, and it's one of the rare successes. But it definitely shows what I think all of your visitors there share with me today, and that is the hope that is associated with a willingness to take risks in telling the truth. And I'm honored to be part of your group and discussion today.
Thank you again. So let's continue up here. Where do we have our friends? Coleen? Matthew? Can you take your seats here? Arne? And Norman? Where's Norman? You're up there. I even forgot your name.
You want to be there by yourself again?
Sure.
Let me start by introducing these people. These are just a few of the ones discussing whistleblowers. They came to Oslo with two questions. What is the state of whistleblowing today, and what can we do to support them? And we're going to work one more day on this issue. On my right there, we have Coleen Rowly. She is a special agent for FBI.
Was.
She's got a good story, and she's going to tell you about that. Then we have Matthew Ho. Matthew Ho served in Afghanistan as the highest-ranking civilian in Afghanistan for the Americans. After a few months, he found that this was not something he could continue doing. He will tell you more about that. Arne Ruth is a voice from Sweden. He served as a chief editor for Expressen and Dagens Nyheter for more than 22 years, so he's really a voice in Sweden. And then Norman Solomon has been organizing whistleblowers and support for whistleblowers and opening up doors for whistleblowers in the States, in Washington, the last years. Coleen, tell us the story of how FBI special agent becomes not wanted in the circles, high circles of Washington.
Well, I just want to say, when you watch this history of 40 some years ago, and the Ellsberg story is one thing, but there's other stories. What we talked about the last few days was history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it rhymes. And the only thing that we don't know is, in living in this current certain moment of uncertainty, is that we don't know how it ends. No, it's great to see this because you see the ending. We can see from history, though, that many times the truth, it sometimes takes a while. You know, people like Martin Luther King Jr., who now is celebrated with this national holiday, at the time that he was doing what he was doing, he was considered as terrible, a dangerous and public enemy as Ellsberg and as Edward Snowden is now. He was exactly treated the same. In fact, a few days ago in the New York Times, they released the full, unredacted letter that the secret COINTELPRO in the FBI sent to Martin Luther King Jr. on the eve of his acceptance of the Nobel Peace Prize in order to intimidate him through blackmail, not to, they called him names, pretended that they were another black leader telling him these things. It's a pretty darn incredible when you understand what the government can do. My little story is that 1 week before 9/11, I was one of 56 legal counsel that were mandated to give ethics training that was required for all thousands of FBI employees. It's a long story why this was required. It was due to a prior scandal. And so 1 week beforehand, I gave this thing that said, never cover up, never puff, shade, skew, massage, tailor statements of fact, never sacrifice your primary loyalty to the Constitution simply to not tell the truth and to prevent institutional embarrassment, quote unquote. So that was 1 week. The next week, the attacks occur. There is complete cover-up to prevent institutional embarrassment. So it's that quick. And when you're confronted with that stark a contrast, and everybody knew it, we made calls. We said, Condi Rice is standing up there saying, no one knew a plane would fly into a building. That summer, there were warnings, so to the point where the 9/11 Commission later said the system was blinking red. There was so much coming in. The directors, both the CIA and the NSA, FBI, said that their hair was on fire. There was so much. But yet, afterwards, you would never have known this. So the bottom line is that because the truth was not really divulged afterwards, this is why we're in the situation. This is why Islamic State and the rest is occurring, because they immediately launched what Cheney called the dark side. That was his answer to 9/11. Let's go monitor, let's go illegally monitor citizens, let's torture, let's say the Geneva Conventions no longer apply, let's get our own lawyers to make up new secret interpretations of all of due process, of long established laws. So, I mean, we are really in a bad situation at this point, and it's simply because when bad things happen, I know when he was asked, it's like that old story about the emperor where the little boy yells, "You're naked." The emperor has no clothes. Does everybody know that story? Okay, so we know the part of the story. They yell, and so when you realize the emperor is naked, the end of the story is the emperor keeps marching. Everybody's laughing, and this is what we're doing. We're saying, how could this is so crazy at this point. We all know this is devoid of any logic, let alone legal, and yet the emperor keeps marching. So I tried real hard. I wrote this memo that went public. The only reason I'm here is because Time Magazine and other public media got a hold of that memo And that protected me, and I ended up with 4 senators writing to the director, don't fire Coleen Rowly. I was really lucky. I was one of the last lucky people that was able to get a little bit of truth out. It led to an Inspector General investigation that was part of the 9/11 Commission. So it led to something. It didn't change anything because it came out too late. But I was lucky, and now, because I was on the cover of Time magazine, there are new people that thought that you could do this. You could be a whistleblower. And of course, we tell people to be whistleblowers, but then they don't have nearly, most of them have not nearly had as easy a time, and they've been persecuted and prosecuted, etc.
I mean, in 2002, Coleen got the name of the year in Time magazine in front there, together with 2 other women. But you also played a role in Powell's infamous speech at the UN, didn't you?
Well, I mean, the thing is, once you've been a whistleblower on an issue, and of course, if something had changed, I mean, if it changes, you can then, I think, go back to maybe breathing a sigh of relief. In this case, nothing changed after. I mean, it actually all changed for the worse. So because all of these things started, I was just even saying, I saw stuff on my desk after 9/11 that was completely, illegal. So what are you supposed to do now? You can't just say, well, I wrote a memo once. Now, new things kept happening. I didn't know torture was happening, but in hindsight, I heard people talking about it. It was like I heard people talking about how this was going on. So I continued to speak out, and I more or less predicted that the Iraq War would turn horribly counterproductive. One of the reasons that you've got the soaring jihad extremists right now in the Mideast, and you don't have to go by Coleen Rowly, General Stanley McChrystal said publicly, for every person we're killing, 10 new people are being radicalized. You can't win any kind of a war like this if everything you're doing in the sense of you say do something means kill people, and 10 new people are being created for every one that you kill. It's impossible. And that's our own generals that have said this.
Thank you, Coleen.
I keep speaking out.
No,
Bottom line.
Wonderful. Matthew, you went to Afghanistan as a patriot, an American patriot. What and when did that turn around?
Just to, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's my first time to Norway, and I really like it. Yeah, just a correction too. When you said earlier, I was a senior American civilian in my part of Afghanistan, not for the entire country. I wasn't the ambassador. I had.
But the ambassador never stepped down. I mean, you were the highest civilian.
To step down, yes.
Yeah.
In that case, yes.
Okay.
When I went to Afghanistan in 2009, I had been to Iraq twice, once with the State Department, once with the Marine Corps, and I had spent the remainder of all that time working either in the Pentagon or the State Department at fairly high levels, just accidentally in a process that was very Forrest Gump-like, if you are familiar with that film. By the time I got to Afghanistan in 2009, the things I was seeing in Afghanistan were the same mistakes we had made in Iraq, and I used the word mistake kind of in a loaded context. Our policies in Afghanistan were fueling the insurgency. We were supporting a corrupt, repressive, predatory government. We were taking part in a civil war, basically supporting, as Dan described, a couple sides in a multi-sided, multi-layered civil war. Al-Qaeda was nowhere present in Afghanistan. And I could no longer, in good conscience, support a policy that was resulting in thousands of American dead and wounded, and tens of thousands of Afghan and Pakistani dead and wounded. So I resigned.
You have been, if not persecuted, at least harassed quite intensely after that. Tell the story about how you've been haunted.
It's interesting. It was December of 2009, so when I came home, I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I got back from Afghanistan, and I ended up getting in contact with a Washington Post reporter, and it became a front-page story, and I became kind of a bit of a minor celebrity for a little bit. And I had the protection of Ambassador Dick Holbrooke and Ambassador Carl Eikenberry because they agreed with me and they agreed with my position, and there was a schism within the U.S. government. So I had their protection. So the harassment started off slow towards me, but eventually General Petraeus' command in CENTCOM noticed that I was doing a lot of television and a lot of media and was having an impact, and they hired a strategic communications firm to discredit me. And they contacted all kinds of radio and television producers with false quotes about me, telling them I was making up who I was, false documentation on me. They put up a false Wikipedia page and actively discredited me. And I actually met the gentleman, and to tell you what type of a crazy world this is and what type of a twisted world Washington, D.C. and this establishment is, I met the gentleman who ran that communications firm. His name was Duncan Boothby. This was in December of 2009, and he came up to me at a Christmas party, introduced himself, and said, "Hopefully you don't mind, and I hope you haven't taken too much offense to it, but I'm the guy who's discrediting you." It just said it's like that. Now, this is why I believe in karma, though, because I'm sure you're all familiar with the late Michael Hastings, who was a friend of mine, wrote the story in Rolling Stone that brought down General McChrystal. The man who set, and this happened December 2009 with me. Michael's story came out in June or July of 2010. The guy who set Mike Hastings up with General McChrystal, Duncan Boothby, the same guy who was coming after me. So I do believe in karma to a certain degree and a certain extent.
Thank you, Matthew. Over to Sweden. Arne, is this relevant for the Nordic countries in any way?
Well, I think it is, although one has, I think, to put it into perspective. And I want to tell you all that in this company, I'm the odd man out, because these are people who have taken extremely courageous stands, which have blocked their career, and they've done it in a world stage setting. I mean, my role as a journalist is simply to keep an interest in getting access to the kind of information which they have made available, so to speak, made public. And Norman here was a major figure in defining the very role of a whistleblower, you have defined a core aspect of democracy building, which is the informed consent of the citizens. Any other sort of democracy building is not democratic. We have to be kept informed of anything which holders of power. And that goes both for political and economic power, which affects our lives as citizens. And the only way of doing that is to have whistleblowers in various sections of society telling us what we deserve to know. Now, Sweden, of course, is not playing anything on the world stage. It is a small country in this northern corner of Europe, like Norway, although it does have a slightly larger population. And we have had some very courageous whistleblowers in relating to Swedish issues as well. I mean, we had the so-called Bofors scandal, which dealt with the corruption, with the compliance of the government of the Swedish defense industry. And of course, in Sweden, since Sweden is defined and defines itself as a neutral country, that doesn't make this country necessarily the most peaceful country in the world. Because, I mean, the logic of being neutral, the political logic and commercial logic has been that since we are not a member of any alliance, we have to have a defense industry which exports weapons all over the world, including to Saudi Arabia. And that is sort of the national parameter, that we have to have this hypocrisy It is a hypocritical system in Sweden. And it's rarely confronted in terms of hypocrisy. Now, I'm not going to comment on the Norwegian situation, which is very different. I mean, the moral aspects have a different parameters, so to speak. But the necessity, even in small, odd countries like Norway and Sweden, to have whistleblowers is certainly present. And that's now where I just want to comment on myself in my role as a journalist and former editor. I mean, Daniel Ellsberg, of course, is an extraordinary person. I mean, continuing his engagement in these moral issues relating to the world is really a model for everyone. But it also requires media who are willing to take risks in publishing whatever the whistleblower tells them. And this, in the Ellsberg case, in the Pentagon Papers, of course, the New York Times acted courageously. I mean, they started to publish it. Nixon blocked that publication of documents, I believe, as I seem to remember, for 15 days. And then there was a Supreme Court decision that they couldn't continue that. Now, that is an aspect of the American system which I think we should reflect on in countries like Norway and Sweden, because at least in the United States, it may be an imperial superpower, but there is a division of powers in the American Constitution, which we certainly don't have in Sweden. It's not as clear-cut. We don't have a Supreme Court which can rashly and with consequence take a stand like that. If there will be a discussion, and of course eventually things might happen, but it's not as clear-cut in terms of separate powers as in the United States. Now, I think as an editor, you have to be very open-minded, and the risk you take as an editor if you publish anything like that can't be compared to what the whistleblowers are facing. That is, but there is still a sort of moral duty, I think, as a journalist, that you should provide the information, which means that citizens get informed about issues which are relating to their existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Arne. Norman, we could see from the film with Daniel Ellsberg that he was supported by a lot of quite famous people: Noam Chomsky, Allen Ginsberg, Howard Zinn. You know, it's a wonderful group there. You yourself are a supporter and a support system for creative support systems for whistleblowers. How important is that?
Well, I think it's extraordinarily important in part because whatever image we may have of those we call whistleblowers, my experiences with people who have that sort of a description are that they are extraordinarily ordinary. And that's so important because we have this tendency, and perhaps it's in the news media as well as other ways, to artificially separate certain people because they have a label from everybody else. And in fact, we're all swimming in the same river in the sense that we have personal struggles in our lives. We have what are called the better angels of our nature. We have other tendencies that are not nearly so noble. And we also face quandaries all the time, where we work, where we live, the institutions we're part of, the gaps between rhetoric and reality, the situations that are sometimes a matter of avoidable human suffering and sometimes matters literally of life and death. And we, to some degree, often a significant degree sooner or later, hear from top officials, in effect, the statement, "Do as we say, not as we do." And so in the case of Americans who are part of institutions like the military or the diplomatic corps or other aspects of the government related to foreign policy, it's the message that you don't get your way through violence. And this is said by people who are engaged in ordering the drones and the cruise missiles and the deployment of troops. And it's a sort of a stance that, as is described in George Orwell's 1984, certain facts are put on the shelf when convenient to retain this huge gap, which can be called and should be called hypocrisy. And yet we're all living to a significant degree in hypocrisy, and not only those engaged in government policies. And so I think that, to sort of get around directly to the question of whistleblowing, it's why whistleblowing is potentially so implosive and explosive in all societies. There is no country in the world where the concept of truth-telling is not potentially incendiary. And so let me just
You have to explain the word incendiary.
Oh, incendiary, explosive, could cause enormous commotion and upheaval and conflict, hopefully creative conflict. So imagine that you live in a country, for instance, that has its leaders talking about their dedication to peace and the historic peace policies of the government, and the government is increasing its military spending. It is looking to acquire some more F-35 bomber jets. It's looking to maybe deploy a new class of submarines. It's pushing to confront a large nation in the Arctic for its own designs having to do with oil and gas and so forth. You don't really have to, if you're Norwegian, you don't have to imagine that, because that's a country you live in. And when John and I went to the Nobel Peace Committee building a little over a year ago with more than 100,000 signatures asking that Manning get the Nobel Peace Prize, you look right across from the Nobel Peace Committee office, and just right across that circle is the U.S. Embassy with all the electronic gear at the top and so forth. And it's symbolic of the way in which different societies, including the U.S. and Norwegian governments, are toxically intertwined for militarism and hypocrisy and the Orwellian combination of lofty rhetoric and deadly policies. And that's one of the main ways in which I think we are compromised morally in our societies, because every day that we remain silent is a day of complicity for the extinguishing of life, while others of us take the easy route. And what whistleblowers are telling us, more importantly than with words, but with actions, is that there is another way.
Matthew, the war doesn't end with what's taking place on the battlefield. You are very much engaged in what takes place when the veterans come back home, the suicides. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. After my second deployment to Iraq, I experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, became suicidal, abused alcohol. A lot of it is what is called moral injury, which basically is that you have taken part in something that either by doing something or failing to do something, you do not live up to your own standards. And the effect on veterans is really quite severe. I don't think it's anything new, because Homer and Shakespeare wrote about this phenomenon. But we are experiencing right now in the U.S. 22 veterans a day killing themselves.
22 every day? 22
every day. At least, I should say at least 22 every day, because the Department of Veterans Affairs only collects data from about 30 out of 50 states on this. We know that more Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have killed themselves after coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan than have been killed in combat in Iraq or Afghanistan. We know more Vietnam veterans have killed themselves after coming home from Vietnam than were killed in Vietnam. And this will only be compounded as my generation of veterans get older. The estimate is that 1 in 5 of us will try and kill themselves, and most will be successful, because when a veteran tries to kill himself, it's almost never a cry for help, and it's almost always with a gun. And that 1 in 5 of us will attempt to kill ourselves or kill ourselves in our lifetime, for those of us who saw combat. This is further the problem, the iceberg, the hidden cost that's out there that really has not been realized, is the amount of traumatic brain injuries in these wars. The estimate now, and as the wars continue, it grows, is that 250,000 veterans suffered traumatic brain injuries in these wars. The cost of the war in terms of killed and wounded is quite low when compared to previous wars. However, that's because of advances in medical technology, as well as advances in our body armor and our vehicle armor. We've all survived things. We all walked away from things in that war that we shouldn't have survived. All of our brains at some point got slammed inside our heads, resulting in concussions, contusions, and these traumatic brain injuries. So there is a cost that we haven't realized yet, because there's a real latency in the traumatic brain injuries. So by no means does this war end when you get home. For many of us, it's more difficult after we get home, because at least when you're on the battlefield, there's some degree of certainty as to what's going on and what you're up against. When you're home and your whole life collapses, when you have that moral collapse and you are planning to kill yourself, it's the hardest challenge you'll probably ever face.
And of course, all of that is put on the back burner when people are sending out the propaganda to make war easy for people.
Absolutely. It's something that's not talked about, not spoken about. It's something that, because the problem is, again, it's so much of this is the moral injury component. That's why so many of us suffer that way. And the only way to get out of that distress is to kill yourself. And it's something I never thought I would be like, something I could never, ever conceive of before it happened to me. And now I'm sober for a couple of years. I'm sober for almost 3 years now, on medication, therapy, and everything else. You look back and you wonder what happened to me. But every now and again, it's something you deal with your whole life. You have to manage. And every once in a while, you have your bad time, and you're back to where you were. You're back to where you're planning it. And the thing for the politicians, for the country, what's so difficult to talk about, is that we're doing this because we realize what we did was wrong. And so if you speak about it, then it's an honest and upfront and forthright validation that the United States wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been wrong. It's very difficult for politicians and the public to do.
Coleen, we're talking about speaking the truth, and you've been engaged in that aspect of truth which we call torture. The effect of torture and the use of torture.
Yeah, going back to the stark contrast, I was in the FBI for 21, 22 years when 9/11 happens, over 22 years. And you're trained as an FBI agent that you can't, not even torture is out of the question. I mean, people laugh about the Inquisition and the Salem witch trials and getting the poor women in the Salem witch trials to confess to being witches. I mean, that was even out of the question. But in the FBI, your early training is not to coerce, even through subtle psychological pressure. And the reason for that is not necessarily because of ethics. The real reason is because you would be perpetrating a fraud on the courts, and because vulnerable people will confess if they are put under pressure. Okay, so after 9/11, they rounded up 1,000. First thing that happened in the first days after 9/11, there were only 16 people on the terrorist list on the day of 9/11. Most of them were the real hijackers. They had been following 2 of them for 2 years, and they were on the list. There's 1 million of all of us right now on the list, non-relevant people. It went from 16 to 1 million names. Okay, so the people that were rounded up in New York, mostly in New York City initially, were just immigrants They were standing on a corner. None of them were terrorists. None. All 1,000 people. Every day we reported to the press, we have 400, 500, 600, 700. It just kept going up to show that, to tell the public, you can breathe easy. We're in charge. We're putting people in jail. About a month later, a quote of anonymous FBI official says, "We might have to take the gloves off because they're not talking." Okay, now think about this. They're all innocent people. So now the thing is they're not talking, so you're going to beat them up? And actually, that was the first time some of them were beat by their jailers because, they're terrorists and they're not talking. So immediately, Cheney, they devised going to the dark side. The first memo was written by John Yoo. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy. He was one of the main go-to guys that made the prior illegal things legal. By writing memos, they were get-out-of-jail-free memos. If you're ever caught later, years from now, then you can say, John Yoo told me, the lawyers told me I could do these things. So the first memo in January of 2002, 5 months later, told the officials, the Geneva Conventions do not apply to the Taliban or to Al-Qaeda. Because they have never signed a treaty, they're non-state actors. So it's a big loophole that anybody that you would call a terrorist or non-state actor will never be protected. What does that mean? Rumsfeld told the troops, you don't have to follow the Geneva Conventions. And immediately then, people were green-lighted in the military to begin these terribly abusive things that in many cases even led to death. Some of them died. And then the CIA undertook a more methodical kidnapping. The same guys wrote several dozen memos. They said kidnapping was legal, all these things. And they sent people to black sites, did waterboarding. Condi Rice, the famous Condi Rice that I just talked about, gave the order to waterboard to the CIA director in July of 2002 before John Yoo wrote his most damning torture memo. She gave the order to do it 2 or 3 weeks. She jumped the gun is what she did. And then she wants to be protected by saying, I was just following the legal advice, but she gave the order to torture before the memo was even written. So we are in a real serious Orwellian, again, that these things are completely illegal. And then on top of that, they are completely unproductive. There's no way. We can't get the torture report, 6,000 pages of torture report right now as we speak, that the CIA tried to spy on our Senate committee, tried to change some things in this committee report. Cost the taxpayers $40 million, 5 years, this torture report. The Obama administration is holding on to it, will not release it right now. And we were hoping that somebody would actually do what Dan Ellsberg did and release it. At the most, we may get a few hundred pages of the 6,000. It was what they claim, or what they say, is the report shows, da-da, what every FBI agent, what everybody that participates knows, torture doesn't work. But yet in the United States, the polls, 60% of the American people think torture works and that we have to torture to find a ticking time bomb to save lives because of this disinformation.
If I can follow up with that real quick, John, because in 2000, I went through the Marine Corps prisoner of war training, and you get tortured there. The guys get waterboarded, you get beat up, you go through all these different, what they now call enhanced interrogation techniques. And the premise of that was to prove to you that torture does not work. The Department of Defense policy was that torture does not work because we had been tortured in war and it didn't work. And so this was not just the FBI saying this. This was the Department of Defense saying this, that torture does not work, but somehow we did it anyway.
I just follow orders. We've heard that before, Arne, haven't we, in Nuremberg?
Certainly. And it's, of course, what Germans and, let's say, European supporters of Hitler were inclined to do during the Second War is a prime modern example. I think, though, the historical record of it should include now something relating to Germany now. Because the paradox of the matter is that the one country in Europe which has really taken a stand in relation to the NSA, National Security Agency's surveillance of everything electronically has been Germany. Certainly, I mean, also journalism in Germany have been dealing specifically with this. Der Spiegel has published a great number of articles relating to it. And the point, of course, is the symbolic aspect that the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, that any things she said on her mobile phone was registered by the National Security Agency, was a very strong element in creating this strong position in also among German politicians of both parties. Now, however, another aspect of it is with this, why Germany is relevant, is that it's also been proven and described, for instance, by Der Spiegel, that the European surveillance centers are located in Germany. So they don't only deal with German matters, they deal with European countries in general. So it's not just a matter of one country in separate from all others. This should be defined as a European question. And in my opinion, I mean, the very fact that the absurdity of a military alliance making allowances in terms of the leading nation in this alliance being able to spy on everybody in an allied country, it's totally absurd. And yet it's possible, and it's done. And I would say that Norway, as a member of the NATO, should be taken an interest in this as well. And it's not just a Norwegian issue. It's a simple fact that you should not accept that the United States takes the right to be in an alliance and then do whatever it wants with whatever information it gets in relation to the allies. Some sort of trustworthiness between allied parties should at least be this is sort of that would be a more normal situation.
So you throw the ball over to Norway. I'd like to invite Jørgen Johansen to come up here. Tell the story about, go back to 1983 and the story that you experienced.
Well, as most of you know, when Norway joined the NATO membership, it was divided. Quite a lot of people didn't like to join NATO. And the government has to do some deals in order to get a majority in favor of it. And one of the deals was no nuclear weapons in Norway and no foreign bases. And then the majority were in favor of a membership. The opposition criticized this deal, but the most important thing was they didn't thought it was real, that we had American bases in Norway. Everyone who talked about that was seen as a lunatic, as a leftist, as a crazy guy. But I was part of a small group who in the late 70s decided to find out the truth about it. And we spent 5 years collecting information from as many sources as possible. And we could present a map in 1983 with 13 American bases in Norway. And the reaction was police raid, accused for spying, and years of court cases. We all ended up being found not guilty by the Supreme Court, but it was 3 against 2 votes. So very, very close. But I have a paper that I'm not a spy, and that's more than you have. But another comment on this is the self-image from Norway is very troublesome for me. The peace nation. I mean, the propaganda machinery is being very efficient. Some things that they don't want to tell us about and should be leaked. It takes very often many years. Norway was one of the most eager ones to sell oil to South Africa during apartheid. A Norwegian invented the landmines and anti-personnel mines. He's absolutely censored from every school book in Norway. Norway sold heavy water to Israel and nuclear bombs. And a Norwegian guy built and maintained Guantanamo for 8 years. He got the prize in Norway, the Peer Gynt Prize. I mean, we could go on and go on. The image of Norway as a peace nation is completely false. And I feel embarrassed by the lack of leakers and whistleblowers in Norwegian companies and in the state apparatus. It's embarrassing as a state to try to convince people that you're a peace nation. It's far from. And it's partly because we have too few whistleblowers in Norway that this image is possible to keep up and be seen as the real picture. I'm worried.
Thank you, Jørgen. Yeah. I mean, if there's an elephant in the room, not physically, but mentally, it's NSA. The huge, I mean, how huge it is. Kirk Wiebe, can you say a few words about NSA and your own experience and trying to rectify what you found there? Kirk Wiebe from
Good evening
NSA.
to all of you. Thank you for coming. It increases our hope that there are people that care about this kind of thing. Let me just give you a very, very rapid overview, and I mean 2-minute description of how I got here. When I was a young man, I came out of the gymnasium, the high school in Indiana, and I wasn't ready to go to college, so I joined the United States Air Force. They chose me to learn the Russian language. There was a Soviet Union that needed to be watched, the infamous bear. So I did that. I was stationed in Turkey, a place about 70 miles south of Istanbul, for some 18 months. And then I went, I wasn't interested in going back stateside. I enjoyed foreign travel, so I asked to be sent to Japan. So I went to the northernmost island of Japan, and on a clear day, 26 American miles across the water, you could see Sakhalin Island, which is an impact point for Soviet missile testing. So did that for about 15 months, went back to the United States, obtained a master's level degree in Russian. I enjoyed languages. And then applied to NSA. NSA hired me as a Russian linguist and did a lot of language processing, translating, that kind of thing, and then became an intelligence analyst, and then went into management of intelligence analysts. And at that point, the work, I can honestly tell you, was noble. I was not aware of the use of American spying technology against allies or against Americans. And so there was no reason not to feel pretty good about the work we were doing. 9/11 comes. Things change. At that point, I'm working with a small group of people on new technology at NSA to deal with digital communications. They were exploding. We were going from the world of radio point-to-point communications to digital networked communications. And the volumes were doubling, tripling, geometrically. NSA couldn't deal with it. We made a breakthrough. We found a way to exploit those kinds of communications and at the same time protect people's identities, protect privacy of the innocent. And we didn't differentiate between foreigners or Americans. If you were not of suspicion, you didn't have to worry that some analyst at NSA was going to look at your private life. So lo and behold, after 9/11, they asked Bill Binney, the developer of this system, to go in at midnight and remove the encryption that was protecting identities. From that moment on, mass surveillance began to grow and grow and grow, collect more, store more. You've heard about this huge database in Utah. It's probably as long as Oslo, as far as that's concerned. It's huge. The only reason you build something like that is to store all the information you can possibly collect about everyone. And the theory is, if I don't know someone's a bad person today, then I may find out they're a bad person tomorrow, so I have to go back and look at that information. So we're all guilty until proven innocent. That's not the way the American Constitution was set up. I doubt if it's the way the Norwegian Constitution was set up or the Swedish Constitution. So it's fundamentally wrong, it's unethical, it's indecent, and it's really hurting NSA's ability to do the right kinds of intelligence on the things it needs to pay attention to. Too much data is like your email at home. You get too much email, you go, oh my God, I've got to delete 50 things. It gets in the way. So anyway, 9/11 happens. 6 weeks later, Bill Binney, myself, and Ed Loomis say, we can't get management to listen about how to worry about people's privacy. We're going to leave. We could retire. We were old enough. We're older than dirt. So we left the agency, resigned, if you will, took our retirement, formed a small consulting company, and tried to bring it to the US government through the CIA or the DIA. There's various intelligence agencies. They didn't want to hear it. We were going to embarrass everyone. So we were shut down, essentially not able to get those ideas adopted. Suddenly, in 2007, the FBI raids all of us. Comes to our house with 12 agents. They show us their badges. They say, sit outside. And they go through the whole house. They take our computers. And this is me, Bill Binney, Diane Rourke, eventually Tom Drake. And take all these things, go through them, can't find anything wrong. So after 5 years, we are just now getting our computers, hard drives, and data back, family photographs, letters we've written to family. All right. So that's how I got here today, and since then we've been dedicating the rest of our lives on this planet to try to fight the injustice by government. It's wrong, it's unethical, and we're trying to get it changed. And I hope you will join in that fight. Thank you.
So Norman, there's a job to do. Encouraging people to become whistleblowers, isn't that sort of simple? And it takes some courage and from both sides, and it really is, there are repercussions here. Is it advisable to ask people to become whistleblowers? You are doing that, definitely.
Yeah, well, the alternative to having the informed consent of the governed is to have the uninformed consent of the governed, and that isn't democracy at all. If you consent to something and you don't know what it is, then you're simply being dictated to, which is antithetical. So ultimately those are choices that each individual has to make. But you could put it this way, that every day people are inundated with messaging telling them to conform, explicitly and implicitly. Keep your nose clean, do what you're told, don't do anything that might cause you some sort of embarrassment or hostility or even potential punishment from authorities. That's the constant messaging. And if that messaging prevails, then whether our concerns are environmental, human rights, human health, well-being, we're going to go down the tubes as societies and really as humanity on the planet, given climate change, for instance. So the antidote to that kind of poison conformity is to work together to sketch out alternatives. And among the alternatives, and I think as part ultimately of building a healthy civil society, is to learn about whistleblowers of the past and the present and find ways to encourage and sustain that kind of activity. And there's no reason, and there's many reasons not to, tell people that it's risk-free. On the contrary, the very nature of whistleblowing is filled with risk. And even being a real journalist now in many societies, including so-called democracies, entails risk. That's an individual choice that has to be made. But we have to, I believe, build the capacity for people to do that more effectively, to whistleblow and be truth tellers.
Anyone that likes to pose a question or comment? Present yourself, please.
Okay, my name is Eirik Vold. I'm a freelance journalist. Mostly write about international questions. As it was said here previously, you were worried about Norway being a much more militaristic nation than what we seem to be. And since your times, we've been involved in 5 military operations, or wars as they used to be called. And still, we hand out the peace prize. I mean, we had the Libya war. Norway was the single most bombing country in Libya, and there was no debate, even though that war was a direct cause of the biggest terrorist attack on Norwegian interests abroad ever, which was the terrorist attack by Islamists in Algeria, bordering Libya. And there was absolutely 5 or 6 Norwegians died. It was the worst attack that has ever happened to Norwegian interests. There was no debate whatsoever. And yesterday it was on the news that we've handed out more medals to Norwegian soldiers in Afghanistan than we handed out to those who fought the Nazi occupants during the Second World War. So we're obviously entering a very militaristic phase. And still, in spite of the fact that we're involved in 5 different wars, there hasn't been a single Norwegian whistleblower telling from the inside either of the political elite or the military sector who has sort of told the truth or spoken out about how these wars are not serving Norwegian security interests. So my question is, and even so, the press is even worse. I mean, the Norwegian press is, I think, even less critical towards Norwegian participation in wars abroad than the American press, which we used to laugh of 10 years ago. And now I think there's even more silence in Norway than it is in the US, especially the Libya war that was at least debated in the US. It was never debated in Norway. So due to the fact of the absence of political and media debate, actually it seems like the internal whistleblowers would be like the only force we can rely on to actually create this critical debate about Norwegian foreign policy or military policy. But how can the rest of the society contribute to make it more easy for whistleblowers to step forward? That would be my question.
Keep the mic, Eric. I want to pose your question. Keep the mic. Could you want to pose a question or
just speak to that? Good.
Yeah. My name is Rune Ottosen. I'm professor in journalism at Oslo and Akershus University College. I just wanted to comment on your point, because I recently published a book together with a Swedish colleague looking through the Norwegian and Swedish media coverage of Libya, for instance. And you're absolutely right. There was no basic debate in the news media how this UN Resolution 1973 was redefined to regime change. And those legal principle issues are unfortunately not discussed on a thorough principle basis. You asked Mr. Ellsberg here about Norwegian participation. Well, how was the constitutional treatment of that decision in the parliament? Has that been discussed very critically in the press? Is this a legal engagement? Has it a UN Security Council decision behind it? No. Is that discussed in the media, in the public? Well, to have a public discourse, we need critical media. And unfortunately, on this kind of issues, this is lacking. Thank you.
Anyone? Eric posed a question. Coleen?
Someone said, you know, we had the coalition of the willing, the first Iraq war, and someone said, let's call it the coalition of the reluctant, because there are a few, but they're reluctant. As time has gone on, it seems like the rhetoric, and I can't remember who I was discussing this with, but there was also somebody that's like a whistleblower insider. The rhetoric has gotten more and more surreal, more out of Orwell. President Obama gave a speech to West Point a few months ago, and he started it off with, I believe in American exceptionalism with every fiber of my being. And West Point cadets erupted. I mean, these are the types of things. It seems to me that they're trying too hard to convince people, because, you know, people are seeing through this. And so we just had in Washington, D.C., a concert for valor, military valor. Every football game is all red, white, and blue, and they worked for weeks just recently. Thousands and thousands of people put red, white, and blue for weeks and weeks, so that at this game they could all stand up and say, "Fight on, veterans, we love you," etc. So it seems to me that that this is happening, but the public. Everybody should be a whistleblower, everyone. There are hard questions that every member of the public should be asking. We're the ones facing the threats now. These threats do exist. They've increased because of what's happened. So when you have a domestic terrorist attack right now, which we had one in Boston, but we have 500 people that have been killed through domestic terrorism from people that have been radicalized, as Timothy McVeigh, by the way. Timothy McVeigh, who did the last Oklahoma bombing, was a product of Gulf War I. So was the sniper in D.C. So people need to be asking these questions because your own safety is endangered. And that means letters to the editor. It means writing. When there is a courageous reporter that does print the truth, they need to get pats on the back, because oftentimes they fall under trouble. They get actually threatened. In the United States, some of our reporters are being threatened now with jail for and Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters are being threatened. So they need to get the public accolades and whatever, the good ones. The ones that are reporting disinfo need to go to jail like Judith Miller did.
I would say, just to echo, Colleen's statements, yeah, put yourself out there. Give that person in the military or in your intelligence service a reason to emulate you. And I think that's the most effective way to support whistleblowers is give them an example. And you all being here is an example of that. But continue to work on this, continue to speak, write, hold events, and give the potential whistleblower an example to emulate.
Eric, you are writing a book. You met Snowden. Tell us.
I haven't met Snowden, unfortunately. If any of you can contribute for that to happen, I would be most grateful. I met Julian Assange, though, yeah. So, and I interviewed Glenn Greenwald in Brazil.
What is your book about?
It's about whistleblowing and the geopolitical game that surrounds it between the West, and especially the West's understanding of itself. How is that changing, or how could it be changed due to the persecution of whistleblowers? So that's basically what the project is about.
And the title is, and when it will come?
The title is still, I'm working on it. Yeah.
Great.
But that's basically the content of I made a pretty interesting interview with Julian Assange. It can be read on truthout.org in English.
Okay, Truthout.
Yeah, it was published in Dagens Næringsliv in Norway.
Okay. I'm happy for your question, and I think it's essential to try to come up with good ideas, how to support them and how to multiply them, the whistleblowers. And that's part of our agenda for this meeting we have these days. There are some manuals out. I published one of them, the Whistleblower, a practical guide, how to help people and to be aware of the problems they are facing. There are a number of different obstacles when you're trying to go public about these things. The problem for us is that the potential whistleblowers of the future should read the book before they go public. And that's a dilemma, because we don't know who they are yet. But at least they have some help afterwards to know what's coming through. And we are planning to build an international network of supporters who could help those who are facing serious problems when they're going public with important information. That's on the agenda for tomorrow.
Yeah.
There's a guy here first.
And in the interim, while that mic is moving, very briefly, you know, there's a saying that courage is contagious. The film that we saw tonight was watched by Edward Snowden before he went public. And he said that watching this film really strengthened his resolve to go ahead and be a whistleblower.
Yeah, for me as well, it was reading a column by Bob Herbert of the New York Times that motivated me to do something.
Could you present yourself?
Yeah, my name is Knut Johannessen. I'm an airline pilot engaged in long-haul operations. I have a question for basically all four of you. In the ideal society, in the perfect democracy, there wouldn't be a need for a whistleblower. And I think we can also make a good case for the fact that there is a need, a legitimate need for certain things of government to be kept a secret. So the question is really, where do you draw the line? In the sense that you could have a case where a whistleblower is wrong. He actually reveals information that shouldn't have been revealed. And then you have all present here today and Ellsberg that are good examples of the opposite. So how do you govern this in the ideal democracy? How would that law, what would that rule look like?
Well, a couple ways to answer that. I'm sure everyone will have a different sort of response. In the American society context, we can ask a very simple and important question. Has our country and the world suffered more from the American people having too much information or too little information? And I think profoundly, from the Vietnam War to all sorts of different catastrophes, it's been through a lack of information being divulged to the public. One can find almost no instance whatsoever that damage has been done by giving too much information to the public. And unfortunately, as is so often the case with so many governments, top officials of the US government lie when they claim that divulging of classified information, of which there are countless millions of documents wrongly so labeled, they claimed that then Bradley Manning had caused this enormous harm, and yet when Manning went on trial and the US government testified and was compelled to back up its rhetoric with any evidence that all of those hundreds of thousands of WikiLeaks documents we heard about had caused the death or harm to US interests even, the government said it could not provide a single instance of any damage.
I was the Freedom of Information Officer in the FBI too, and there's a process that ideally should work. In the justice system, in the first place, there is a need for temporary secrecy. I worked on mafia cases. You couldn't tell the mob guys that you were listening to them when you were doing it. But in a year or two, when you've got enough adequate information, all of the documents and everything, tape recording, everything went to the defense attorneys for them to pore over. That is the ideal because it's temporarily secret. The war isn't too much different. When you're landing on D-Day, no one can know that spot where you're landing. That has to be tactically secret for that period of time. The excessive secrecy that is going on now with basically this is power. Secrecy is giving the power to control information. We've got things from 40, 50 years ago, really incredibly stupid things about the Sputnik that no one would even care about that are still classified. In the last 10 or 12 years, it went from 6 million documents to 92 million documents that were classified, stamped right on them. There's a case right now in the Supreme Court in the United States that may decide, we're all hoping not, that they can post-classify anything that was never even classified. And then the last thing is the law is supposed to be that you cannot classify a document in order to hide any illegal activity. So right off the bat, when you're releasing information, Snowden, for instance, he's trying to give information, but the fact that it's classified because it's hiding what is illegal. So there's a whole bunch of things here, and the process that they've gone through is pretty good, because what they've done with these journalists is, and newspapers, major newspapers got these documents, raw documents, and they blacked out identities. They then even took the extra safeguard of sending them to the NSA and to the CIA. So they got a chance to weigh in and say, no, you can't make that public. So there's actually a process that I think actually that works pretty good. But I agree with you, temporary secrecy, some minimal level of secrecy is absolutely necessary. The question is, it just can't be 40, 50, 60 years the way it is now.
I think for me, in terms of when it comes to war, is whether the truth is being suppressed by policymakers in order to achieve their policy. So in my case, in 2009 Afghanistan, when we had Taliban coming in to negotiate with us, I dealt with that directly. And then the American government says they don't want to negotiate, we have to escalate the war. And that's said by Hillary Clinton, that's said by Secretary Gates, that's said by Leon Panetta. When the aspects of the conflict are in direct contradiction to what the policymakers, the generals, are testifying to, in a sense when they say things as if the insurgency is being defeated, we're diminishing it, when all available information we have is that the opposite is occurring. In my case, too, when General McChrystal came in 2009, he wanted to escalate the war. The White House wanted to escalate the war. They hired outside private individuals to come into Afghanistan to make an assessment, most of whom were employed by think tanks that are funded by the defense industry. And they're the ones who made the assessment that we should escalate the war in Afghanistan, not the State Department, not the CIA, not the Department of Defense. So for me, it's when you see things like that occurring, where the truth is being suppressed to achieve some type of policy aim or goal, that for me is where the line has been crossed and whistleblowing needs to occur.
We have one more question up there. You with the microphone.
Yes, hi, my name is Joe Ekren. I'm a medical doctor. It was fantastic to hear your stories. It's very inspiring. I have a number of colleagues who have blown the whistle on Norwegian health policies, which has been very damaging to a number of patients. And looking into the literature, it seems like being a whistleblower is a very dangerous activity. Most whistleblowers, they give into alcohol, their families dissolve. As you all know, your career will often be blocked. So when we're asking people to be whistleblowers, we're essentially asking people to step in front of an onrushing train. And this onrushing train is some form of administration or tribe or whatever. I don't know. I don't really have a good metaphor for that, but it's sort of us and them. And usually when you're a whistleblower, you're alone. So I'm curious to two things. One is, what strategy should a person use when he's thinking about stepping out in front of that onrushing train? Network, things like that. The other is, what brakes should one install on this train so that the train doesn't plow over people who blow whistles? So the two questions to each of your whistleblowers, you feel.
Thank you for a good metaphor.
Yeah.
Okay. Short answers to that before Arne closes the whole session.
Well, I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who talked about resistance as an individual is not nearly as viable as resistance as part of a community. And whatever is meaningful and strengthening for individuals in terms of their own sense of community and gaining strength from it, that's really essential. It's not a Lone Ranger activity, ideally. And that has the benefit to rely on building community as part of supporting whistleblowers has the benefit not only of helping the whistleblower, but also helping to transform society by normalizing whistleblowing and making it affirmed and exalted, if you will, rather than something denigrated and hidden. And creating fundamental changes in civil society, including government, is going to be essential for, if you will, slowing down and stopping that train from running people over for speaking truth. And that, I think, is part of the complexity of what we're all addressing, because ultimately we need profound changes in the political economy, the way in which even the most avowed democracies allow money and corporate power to dominate government and decision-making, and the way in which not only courage can be contagious, but how silence and acquiescence are contagion. They are deadly, they are poisonous, and shattering the silences are going to be essential if we're going to turn things around.
Arne, the last word is yours.
Well, I think the experiences of whistleblowers, which we've had here, they illustrate a crucial point. These are individual decisions. These are people who decide that at some point they're not going to play the game anymore. They cannot predict the consequences for them as persons. In that sense, it's even more courageous, because they redefine the rest of their lives in a way they cannot say that they benefit from it in any way, and yet they do it. And I think an element in this is since we've heard now how there is a sort of modeling element in it, that you're impressed by learning about people who have taken this stand. So you decide that you are going to follow that example in relation to your own background. I think that is part of it. Now, man is a social animal, and it means that purely individualistic decisions of this kind will not be possible. I mean, it is a social phenomenon. It is based on individual decisions, and yet it is a social phenomenon. The social element in it, in my opinion, is that in any democracy, you have to have citizens who are compassionate about democracy. Not everyone will be it, but at least some people will be willing to do it also on the basic level. And if I'm not going to paint a rosy picture of the Scandinavian countries, but in my opinion, there is one element in the Scandinavian countries which make them slightly different than Britain or continental Europe, which is a system of access to education regardless of class background. I came as a refugee from Germany to Sweden in 1945 as a one-year-old. And my mother had to find some way of supporting us, and she became a teacher eventually. We were not poor, but in a different country, when you come as a refugee, then you're facing problems. In the welfare system, at least there were chances, thanks also to education. And I think an educated, a reasonably educated population is important in creating that kind of social empathy which is necessary in order to support whistleblowers when they appear. I don't think you can create a system where you include whistleblowing in the Constitution. It will remain a paradox, however you define it. Now, I think the comment we heard from up there, from you, who is a doctor, is also a very important element in this, that doctors told unpleasant truths about what was happening in the healthcare system. I mean, there's the people who are dealing with these highly sensitive issues of national security. Of course, they face political risks. They face all sorts of repressions, and the Ellsberg case is of course, it illustrates it clearly. However, on the everyday level, we also need whistleblowers, people who observe things which are strange in where they work, and who tell these truths in some way in order to change that kind of repression. And you know, I mean, one sentence which I think is not irrelevant is the observation that all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I've been holding power myself as a journalist, and of course I had to face sometimes difficult moral problems. I had to define things in terms of that interest in relation to that interest, and I made many wrong decisions without pressure, without people observing what I was doing. I would have made even more wrong decisions. And any power has to be confronted. And I think in the social sector, there is lots of strange things happening where I think nurses should be supported in telling what they observe in a hospital situation. This is not just a matter for the elite, it's a matter at the very basic level in a democracy. And I think this, if you define it in these terms, it is really the obligation of any citizen to react in a democracy to whatever he or she feels should be changed.
Norman, Arne, Matthew, and Coleen, Kirk, and Jørgen, thank you for, and all of you, thank you for coming.